Thank you, Samia, for making it and for accepting to be part of us. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So thank you, first of all, for inviting me. Divine and Isabella, it's an absolute pleasure for me to be here today. The topic that you've asked me to speak about is challenges in international North Africa research partnerships, which is something that aligns quite wonderfully with the title of my PhD research project. And so I thought what I'm going to do with my time here today is to share a little bit with you some of the insights that I think are relevant to this discussion and to your strategy and to the work of your group. And then also perhaps share some of my thinking around what some of the points are that you might want to consider going forward. So just very briefly to give you a little bit of background, my PhD research project was entitled North-South Partnerships in Public Higher Education. I looked at a selected South African university as a case study. I was awarded the degree in 2019. So if you're interested in the thesis, it's available on the WITS Wired repository. The main things, I think, as the title suggests, the main concepts that I looked at were higher education, internationalization, and partnerships. And I reflected on partnerships and internationalization specifically from a post-colonial or decolonial lens. What was important for me was to focus on a global South perspective on these issues and on the lived realities of North-South partnerships for people in the South and at universities in the South. And perhaps just to declare, I think it's quite important that you also understand my own positionality, which I deal with quite extensively as part of my research. But just to mention two things here, I am of the North and the South in terms of my own genetic makeup, and also in terms of my education and work experience, which is mostly based in Germany and in South Africa. And I'm also a practitioner scholar. So I'm someone who's worked in international education and international collaboration for more than 20 years now. And I would consider myself an emerging scholar in that field. And when I set out to do my PhD, it was actually to dig deeper into those issues that I experienced as a practitioner in the field. That was one of my main motivations. And now, of course, that I've gained some better understanding of these partnerships, I also want to look for opportunities wherever I can to make a contribution towards improved practice. And this is why a conversation and an invitation like the one today is so particularly exciting for me. What I'd like to do next is just share 4 main areas of challenges with you that I think, Isabella, you touched on at the beginning, and perhaps I can illustrate them a little bit more. What I'd like to do is to read out to you some quotes, direct quotations from my research and my research participants to illustrate what some of the issues are. And I think much of that will resonate with you. So I don't want to go into too much detail, but I always think it's useful and helpful to hold the voices of research participants in integrity. So one of the main areas of challenge is actually attitudes and expectations when it comes to partnerships. And so my research participants say things like, we're being treated like vast bed and breakfasts. They don't want an intellectual input from our side. Or the approach of Northern partners is, what can we do for you? Not what can you do for us? So these North-South partnerships reflect an imperialist kind of relationship between the imperial ruler and the colonial ruled. So by design, they're often developmental partnerships. Another area of challenge is around funding and the monopoly of resources. I don't want to go into too much detail, but it's essentially about institutions in the North as being perceived as the ones that have the money, that have the endowment funds, that have everything. And Southern scholars being very anxious about the consequences of resources being monopolized by Northern institutions and the unequal politics that derive from unequal control over resources. Another area of concern and of challenge in North-South partnerships is quite clearly linked to imbalances in resources and benefits of these partnerships. And I want to share with you an example that I feel illustrates the points very, very clearly. And that was a researcher from molecular biosciences who shared with me that her working space is the old broom closet in her school. And one of her most important international partners at the time was a partner at a Belgian university who she compares her own facilities to his and says, you know, I work in the old broom closet and he has a state-of-the-art corridor of facilities. And I think that kind of like really illustrates it very well, to say, you know, whether you operate out of a broom closet or out of a corridor of state-of-the-art facilities, obviously will influence the kind of work and the kind of output you can achieve. But not only that, in addition, the South African researcher also had a heavy teaching load, several hundreds of undergraduate students, around 50 master students, and a handful of PhD students that she supervised at the same time as being engaged in her international partnership. Whereas her Belgian colleague was a research professor and had no teaching to do whatsoever. And not only that, he also had a whole team of research assistants that would help him with implementing the project, writing up research reports, you know, applying for funding, et cetera, et cetera. And she was in the situation where she had no help at all. It was only her that was involved in that project, and she needed to find time to do that mostly in the evenings and over weekends. And yet these two will compete for the same places in university rankings, for example, when it comes to, you know, assessing their academic and their research output. And the last area of challenge is what I named the hegemony of Northern knowledge, which I think, especially for research-intensive universities, of course, as sites of knowledge production, is an important element. And here my participants, for example, reflected on the fact that knowledge is mainly produced with the conventional gaze from the north to the south, and a convention of northern theory and southern field studies. Others reflected on what one of the geoscientists called hit and run type of science, where people come and grab some rock samples and then they take them away and publish on them. And of course, also related to that is not only the actual conducting the research or being involved in a project, but also what happens afterwards in terms of knowledge dissemination, and the hegemony of international northern-based journals, etc., where somebody observed you have to be careful where you publish because people measure you in terms of what you put in, where you put your work. So you have to be very strategic about which outlets you choose. And so these are some original voices from my research participants, and I want to ask the question, so what? You know, I think to some extent these illustrate what you said at the beginning, Isabella. I think, you know, there is nobody here in this group probably who would say there are no imbalances of resources, power, and knowledge in these kind of engagements between Africa and the global north and other global south locations. I think to some extent also examples like this give credence to the opinion that internationalization can be considered recolonization to some extent, that you know, there is a focus on the extractive nature of these partnerships, that we've moved from raw materials, the extraction of raw materials under colonialism, to the extraction of raw facts, data, and talent under the guise of internationalization. But I also want to say that I think recognizing these challenges is also an opportunity to make a change and to change the North-South paradigm. And in the words of Professor Didip Menon, to use the global South perspective as an invitation to imagine the world afresh. And I want to, you know, do a little bit of that and share some of my thoughts around what could perhaps be a way forward for you in this group regarding your strategy to establish more equitable research partnerships, or a framework and approach for that. And so I think whatever framework one comes up with, I think for me, very clearly, it would need to have a focus on mutuality, balance, or inclusion. Those are really different terms that I think speak to, you know, in essence, the same thing, to say there needs to be a balanced approach when it comes to research outputs and research outlets in particular between Northern and Southern, or Northern and African scholars. I also think there needs to be a strong commitment to recenter Africa in all of the conversations, debates, and projects. This is, of course, linked to conversations and efforts around transformation, decolonization, and Africanization, which many of you will be aware in South Africa, since Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall have been very much at the foreground of some of these conversations that we're having. And I think in terms of research questions and research methodologies, this is also something that is particularly important. I was very uncomfortable in my own research, for example, looking at post-colonial and decolonial perspectives, and you know, a kind of like a willingness to explore and do things differently, and then being confined by very clear ideas of what my thesis were, you know, had to look like, how many chapters it had to have, et cetera, et cetera. So there is this kind of tension, I think. Another thing that I think is particularly important is to focus on knowledge production by the South, about the South itself, but also about the North. And I don't know if some of you have had an opportunity to read the little article that I published in University World News, where I shared this phrase that one of my research participants used to say, you know, we are interested in returning the gaze. So in specifically counteracting that traditional gaze from the North to the South, to say we are returning that, we are now looking at the North and we are creating knowledge about the North in the South by ourselves. And I think the last point that for me is particularly important, and that can be facilitated by post-colonial, decolonial thinking, Southern theories, etc., is criticality. And to say, you know, we really need to be very critical in our engagement with everything. And I think Elisio has just done a wonderful illustration of how we look at development. For me, that is the very rhetoric of development is problematic. And to say, you know, what do we do for sustainable development goals in Africa? That is, I think, where we need to start. And then in my own engagement and working in the partnership space between the North and the South, I think we also really need to look very critically at the terms of engagement between the former colonized and the former colonizers, and particularly in a framework like the Worldwide University Network, where we have representatives of both. I think those are the kind of spaces to have open and frank discussions. Thank you so much.